It feels like South Africa is walking a political tightrope right now. You've got
Yeah.
these two major players in the government, the ANC and the DA, and they're trying to work together, but they just seem at odds on some pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, and it's definitely causing some friction, right?
Absolutely. And a big part of that friction seems to be coming from the Expropriation Act. So that's what we're going to try to untangle in our deep dive today.
And you've got some really fascinating sources for us, all centered around how these discussions were playing out in late March 2025. So we're really going to dig into that and see where the ANC and the DA were in terms of this whole land issue.
So, for anyone listening who maybe needs a little refresher, the Expropriation Act is essentially South Africa's new system for, well, how the government can take ownership of land.
Right, it's like an update to their land laws.
Exactly. It replaced the old 1975 Act, which we all know was a product of the apartheid era. So, the idea here is to create a framework that works for South Africa today, and a big part of that is dealing with the huge disparities in who owns what when it comes to land.
And that's where the central tension lies, right from the get-go. The ANC sees this act as absolutely essential to making real progress on land reform. They view it as a way to right historical wrongs. But the DA, on the other hand, they see it as a huge threat to property rights and to the overall stability of the economy.
And this isn't just some abstract debate, right? This thing was signed into law on January 23rd, 2025. It's actually on the books. But the catch is the date it actually comes into effect, well, that hasn't been announced yet. So it's in this weird limbo.
Exactly. And that lack of a start date, that creates a window, right? A period of intense pressure where everyone is trying to figure out how it's all going to work in practice.
It's like a ticking time bomb in a way. So let's dive into the nuts and bolts of this act. What are the key things people need to understand about what it actually says?
Well, at its core, it gives the state the power to take private property. And the stated reason for doing so would be public purpose or public interest.
Okay, but those terms are pretty broad, right?
Yeah. Oh, they are. And that's definitely one area where we could see a lot of debate. It basically boils down to whatever the government decides is a reason to need that land. Maybe building a new hospital, a highway, things like that.
I can already see how that could get messy.
It definitely could. But the real flashpoint, the thing that's causing the most controversy, is what the Act says about compensation. It says that if land is expropriated, there needs to be just and equitable compensation.
Okay, on the surface, that sounds reasonable, but I have a feeling there's more to it.
There is. Because the Act also includes this provision that nil compensation might be possible under certain very specific circumstances.
Wait, so the government could essentially take land without paying for it?
In theory, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But only in very specific cases, like if the land is totally unused or if it's creating some kind of health hazard. So, there are some safeguards, but you can see why this has people worried.
I can definitely see that. It seems like this idea of nil compensation really cuts to the heart of why this act is so controversial. So let's zoom out a bit. To really understand why the ANC is pushing so hard for this, we need to look at the historical context, right? Because the history of land ownership in South Africa is a story of inequality, to put it mildly.
It's a stark reality. The sources we're looking at today show that over 80% of South Africans who are black own only about 4% of the private farmland. And on the flip side, about 7% of the population who are white own roughly 3/4 of that land.
Those numbers are just striking. It really lays bare the legacy of apartheid.
It does, but it's also important to remember, as our sources point out, that land ownership in South Africa isn't just a simple black and white issue.
Right. There are other layers to this.
Exactly. A big piece of the puzzle is the amount of land that's owned by the government itself. And it's actually surprisingly difficult to pin down an exact number.
Oh, how so?
Well, depending on who you ask and how you define government-owned, you'll hear numbers ranging from 14% to 25% of the total land area.
Wow, that's a pretty big range.
It is. And remember, the ANC was in charge of the government departments that handle land issues for a long time, right up until 2024.
Right. And then things shifted with the GNU.
And that brings us to another interesting point from our sources. With the GNU in place, the Department of Public Works now has a minister from the DA. And this minister has come out and said that the government's own records on land ownership are a mess.
Like they don't even know what they own.
Pretty much. It's almost comical in a way. They've got this law about taking land, but they might not even have a good grasp on what they've already got.
That's incredible. It really makes you wonder how they could possibly implement any kind of large-scale land reform if they don't even have a clear picture of their starting point.
It's a fundamental question.
Yeah.
And then, to make things even more complicated, you have to factor in the role of traditional authorities.
Yes, the Zulu King and the Inganyama Trust, right. That was a really interesting part of the sources.
Absolutely. So, the Inganyama Trust, it was established in 1994, just before the transition to democracy, and it holds something like 2.8 million hectares of land in KwaZulu-Natal.
Which is like, what, a third of the whole province?
Yeah, somewhere between 29% and 32%. And this land is held in trust for the Zulu people, with the Zulu King as the sole trustee. So it's a completely different model of ownership.
It's not private ownership, it's not government ownership, it's like a whole other category.
Exactly. And it just shows how complex the picture of land ownership is in South Africa.
It's not as simple as it might seem on the surface.
Not at all.
So let's bring in the political angle here. The Expropriation Act, it was passed before a pretty big change in South African politics, right?
It was. Remember, the ANC lost their outright majority in parliament in the 2024 elections for the first time since apartheid ended. And that's what led to the formation of the GNU, with the DA as a major partner.
Right, so now the DA has a lot more leverage than they used to.
Exactly. They went from about 20% of the vote to being part of the government. And that's given them a platform to really push back against the Expropriation Act.
So what are their main objections, and what have they actually done to try to stop it?
Well, their stance is pretty clear. They say the act is unconstitutional, and they're worried it's going to scare off investors, both domestic and international. Their argument is that it weakens property rights, and that's bad for the economy.
So it's not just talk, they've taken concrete action.
Oh, yeah. In February 2025, they filed a legal challenge in the Western Cape High Court. They're saying the process of passing the act was flawed, and that the clauses about nil compensation are just too vague.
So they're going after it from both sides, the process and the content.
Exactly. And they've also raised the issue within the GNU itself. They invoked Clause 19 of the Coalition Agreement, which seems to be about how to handle disagreements. Basically, they're saying the ANC didn't consult them properly before pushing this through.
It seems like they're really digging in their heels, and then, to top it all off, you've got the international reaction.
Right. Our sources mention that even Donald Trump got involved. He issued an executive order in February 2025 that froze aid to South Africa.
Wow, I guess this really is on the global radar.
It is. And even though the Expropriation Act wasn't the only reason for the aid freeze, it was definitely a factor.
So turning to the ANC, what's their position now? They obviously believe very strongly in this act.
Their argument is that it reflects the will of the people, since it was passed by a parliament where they had a majority. They see it as the only way to truly address the injustices of the past when it comes to land ownership. And to be fair, there's an argument to be made that not addressing those injustices also leads to instability.
Right, it's a complicated situation, but given the new political landscape with the GNU, they can't just go it alone. Right?
Yeah. No, they can't. And our sources suggest they might be open to some kind of compromise with the DA. There are reports that they're willing to look at a counterproposal, maybe amending certain parts of the act or clarifying how it would be implemented.
It sounds like they're at least willing to come to the table. So if they do manage to sit down and negotiate, what are the main things each side is going to be pushing for?
Well, the DA is going to want stronger protections for property rights. They might ask for tighter rules on when expropriation can happen, or insist that compensation is always close to market value. Basically, they want to limit the possibility of nil compensation as much as possible.
And the ANC?
They're going to want to make sure the act still fulfills its purpose, which is to enable land reform. They won't agree to anything that they feel would gut the act and make it ineffective.
It really does feel like a make-or-break moment for the GNU.
It does. And our sources even suggest that this whole debate over the Expropriation Act is a kind of test case for the stability of the coalition government.
I mean, the DA is also opposed to other big ANC policies like the national health insurance, right?
Exactly. So it's not just about land. It's about how these two very different parties can actually govern together.
And these different perspectives are playing out in public too, right? Those ex-posts you pulled show how divided people are in the DA's role in all of this.
Yeah, some people see them as obstructionists who are blocking progress, while others see them as defenders of property rights who are keeping the ANC in check. It's a really polarizing issue.
Absolutely. So zooming back out, where do things stand as of late March 2025? What's the bottom line?
Well, the act is law, but no land has actually been expropriated under it yet. And that start date, when it all goes into effect, well, we're still waiting for that.
So the clock is ticking.
It is. And as we get closer to the budget deadline for 2025-26, the pressure is going to keep mounting.
So just to wrap this up, we've got this brand new coalition government grappling with one of the most sensitive issues in South Africa's history, land. And on top of that, you've got legal challenges, international pressure, and deep divisions within society itself.
It's a textbook example of how messy politics can be, especially when you're dealing with historical injustices and strong ideological differences.
It really makes you wonder how they're going to find a path forward.
It does. And, as we end this deep dive, I keep thinking about those underlying issues we talked about. The fact that the government might not even have a clear picture of its own land holdings and the role of traditional authorities like the Zulu King, those factors are going to be there no matter what happens with the Expropriation Act.
They're pieces of the puzzle that just can't be ignored. And it's something for all of us to ponder, really. How do you reconcile competing visions for the future when you're dealing with such a complex issue like land?
Exactly. And that's a question that goes far beyond South Africa.
It certainly does. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, journey into the world of South African politics. And we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues and to stay engaged with the developments as they unfold.
Absolutely. These are conversations that need to be had.
Thanks again.
It was my pleasure.